Welcome to this episode of Quadratic Equations. So in our today's lesson, we shall look at quadratic equations. Remember to visit our Facebook page, Next Minds Virtual Learning, and like it. On YouTube, subscribe to Mr. Academia to enjoy all our lessons. Send us a WhatsApp text on this number and also visit our website for any educational material that you want to use. By the end of our lesson, you should be able to solve quadratic equations using the graphical method, factorization method, by completing squares, and also by the quadratic formula. So let's start by defining what a quadratic equation is. So a quadratic equation is basically an equation which is of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. So a should not be equal to 0. A here, it shouldn't be equal to 0. An example is if we have x squared plus 5x plus 26 equals to 0. Or another example of a quadratic equation is this, or this one here. So the coefficients of the quadratic equation are a, b, and c. And a is what we call the quadratic coefficient, and then b is what we call the linear coefficient, and c is the constant. So you can see the position of a, the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x, and c is the constant. So if the equation is in the form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, this is what we call a quadratic function. Looking at the ways in which we can solve quadratic equations, there are 4 ways. We can use factorization method, we can use the graphical method, we can use completing squares, or we can use the quadratic equation. So we shall start by looking at how we can use the first one, which is the factorization method. So the first step in using factorization method is that we rearrange the equation so that one side is 0, and then we fully factorize the other side, and we apply the principle that if AB equals to 0, then A equals to 0 and B equals to 0. So we go ahead and solve the part A equals to 0 and the part B equals to 0, and we get the answers for the equations. An example is here, and let's look at how we apply the quadratic formula to get the answers for each of these examples. So starting with the first example, which is x squared plus 17x plus 16 equals to 0. So whenever you have a question like this, so you start by determining the sum and what you call the product of the answers. So quadratic equations always have 2 answers. So there is what we call the sum and the product of the answers. So in this case, in this equation, if you are to determine the value of A, it is equal to 1. The value of B is equal to 17. And the value of C, which is the constant, it is equal to 16. So the sum, if the equation has a coefficient of 1, that is, if the quadratic coefficient A is equal to 1, then the sum is always the coefficient of x, so meaning that the sum of the solutions to the quadratic equation is 17, and then the product of the quadratic solution is always the constant when A equals to 1, so meaning that this is 16. So we then look for 2 numbers, which when we add, we get 17, and when we multiply, we get 16. So the 2 numbers are 1 and 16. So after knowing the 2 numbers, we go ahead and do the factorization. So when we factor these 2 values, we end up coming to this step here, which is x plus 1 into x plus 16 equals to 0. So we then apply the principle, if AB equals to 0, then A equals to 0 and B equals to 0. So that will imply that we can equate this first bracket to 0, and we can also equate this second bracket to 0, which is the step down here. And then finally, we solve these linear equations, and we have x as 1 and x as negative 16. So meaning that the value of x is negative 1 and negative 16, which are the 2 answers to the quadratic equation. If we look at the second example, where we have x squared minus 4x minus 12 So still, if you are to look at this equation here, the sum of the roots is -4, and then the product of the roots is -12. So this implies that we look for two numbers. When you add them, you get -4. When you multiply them, you get -12. So the two numbers are +2 and -6. So you go ahead and factorize these two numbers, +2 and -6, and that is what gives us this step here. So finally, we equate each of the brackets to 0. So we shall have x plus 2 equals to 0. We get x as -2. Then if we equate this to 0, we get x as being equivalent to 6. So this means that the solutions to the quadratic equation are x equals -2 and x equals 6. And having that, we can now look at another formula, which is the graphical formula for solving the quadratic equations. So in the graphical method, we give approximate values for the solution, or the method gives approximate values to the solution. So we start by selecting the range of values for x for the given equation. Then after that, we draw a table and look at the corresponding values of y. We then plot the coordinates or ordered pairs on the graph, and the solutions to the equations are the points where the curve cuts the x-axis. So these points are important because they are the solutions to the quadratic equation. If we look at an example of how we use the graphical method, so in this example, we are required to solve this quadratic equation here. So the first step is we draw a graph. We are supposed to draw this graph here. So we select points between -1 and -4. Those are the points that we selected. So we now tabulate them in a table from -1 to 4. That is the range of values that we selected. So we now feed in our equation. This is x squared here, then -3x, then +2. And then we shall finally add them up. We shall substitute x values in these values, and then we sum these up to get the value of y. So when summing up, we shall get 1, we add it to 3, we add it to +2 and get 6. So when x is 0, x squared is 0, -3x is 0, and 2 remains as +2. So this one here, we can fill it throughout with +2. So when we add 0 plus 0 plus +2, we get 2, so y is 2. Then after doing the whole and completing the table, we extract the ordered pairs. Like for example, the first one, x is -1 and y is 6. So we extract the ordered pairs of coordinates. The next one is 0, 2. The next one is 1, 0. The next one is 1.5, -0.25. The next one is 2, 0. The next one is 3, 2, and the last ordered pair of coordinates is 4, 6. So these are the coordinates that we plot on a graph paper. So let us look at the graph that is plotted for these points. So if you look at the graph here, you realize that these are the coordinates. When we plot them, this is how the curve. So we plot the points. You can see the points we have plotted first. Then after, we draw a free flow curve. So you draw this curve with the free hands. Just join the points with free hand. That is, you draw a free flow curve. So the points where the curve cuts the x-axis, because this is the x-axis, points where the curve cuts the x-axis are the solutions to your quadratic equation. So meaning that in this case, the solutions are x equals to 1 and x equals to 2, because the curve cuts the x-axis at the points x equals to 1 and x equals to 2, as you can see. So basically, this is how we solve quadratic equations using the graphical method and also the method of factorization.